Have you ever been in a situation where someone was treating you like absolute garbage, completely unaware that you held all the power? I'm talking about that moment when you're being insulted, degraded, and humiliated in public, and you have to make a split-second decision. Do you lash out immediately, or do you stay quiet and let karma do its work in the most spectacular way possible? Well, let me tell you what happened to me just 3 months ago, and I promise you, this story will leave you absolutely speechless. I'm still processing everything that went down, and honestly, some nights I lie awake wondering if I handled it the right way. But what I do know is that this experience changed me forever. It taught me things about human nature, about dignity, about revenge, and about the kind of person I want to be when faced with cruelty. My hands are still shaking as I'm telling you this, because the emotions are so raw, so real, so incredibly overwhelming that sometimes I have to stop and catch my breath. This isn't just a story about putting someone in their place. This is a story about discovering who you really are when everything inside you is screaming to react, to fight back, to show them exactly who they're messing with. But I didn't do that, at least not right away, and that decision turned out to be the most powerful move I could have made. Let me paint you a picture of who I am, because it's important for you to understand that I'm not the kind of person who walks around flaunting wealth or status. I'm 34 years old, and if you saw me walking down the street, you'd probably think I was just another regular person trying to make ends meet. I dress simply, usually in jeans and a comfortable sweater. I drive a 10-year-old Honda Civic that's seen better days, and I live in a modest apartment that I intentionally chose because it keeps me grounded. People look at me and make assumptions, and honestly, I've never bothered to correct them because I've learned that the quieter you are about your success, the more you can observe the truth about people's characters. My father used to tell me that real wealth whispers while poverty shouts, and I've carried that wisdom with me throughout my adult life. The thing is, I came from absolutely nothing, and I mean nothing. I grew up in a single-parent household where my mother worked 3 jobs just to keep the lights on and food on the table. I watched her sacrifice everything, her health, her happiness, her dreams, all so that I could have opportunities she never had. I made a promise to myself when I was just 12 years old, standing in our tiny kitchen while my mom counted pennies to buy groceries, that I would never let her struggle again, that I would build something so substantial that she could finally rest. That promise became my driving force, my obsession, my reason for waking up every single day and pushing myself beyond what I thought was possible. I started working when I was 14, lying about my age to get a job at a local restaurant washing dishes. Every single dollar I earned went into a savings account that I protected like it was made of gold. While my friends were out having fun, going to movies, buying the latest sneakers, I was working, studying, and dreaming about a future that seemed impossibly far away. I got a full scholarship to college, thank God, because there was no way we could have afforded it otherwise, and I studied business and finance with a hunger that my professors said they rarely saw. I wasn't just learning for grades. I was learning for survival, for transformation, for that promise I made to my mom. I graduated at the top of my class, but instead of taking some fancy corporate job like everyone expected, I did something that people thought was absolutely insane. I took every penny I had saved, combined it with a small business loan that took me months to secure, and I bought my first property. It was a rundown duplex in a neighborhood that was just starting to show signs of revitalization, and everyone told me I was throwing my money away. My college advisor actually tried to talk me out of it, saying I should focus on building a traditional career first, but I couldn't shake this gut feeling that real estate was my path to the freedom I'd been chasing my entire life. That first property was a nightmare, I'm not going to lie to you. The plumbing was a disaster, the electrical system was dangerous, and I spent every weekend for 6 months doing renovations myself because I couldn't afford to hire contractors. I watched YouTube videos until 3 in the morning, learning how to install drywall, how to fix leaks, how to sand and paint and transform spaces. My hands were covered in blisters, my back ached constantly, and there were moments when I questioned everything, when I wondered if everyone who doubted me was right. But then something magical happened. I finished the renovations. I rented out both units for prices that seemed impossible in that neighborhood just a year earlier, and suddenly I was generating passive income that exceeded what most of my college friends were making at their entry-level corporate jobs. That feeling, that first moment when I realized I had created something that was making money while I slept, was absolutely intoxicating. It wasn't about the money itself, although I'd be lying if I said that wasn't important. It was about the validation that my instincts were right, that I could trust myself, that I could build the life I'd always dreamed about. I didn't stop there. I lived extremely frugally, probably more frugally than I even needed to, but I was terrified of losing everything I'd built. Every dollar of profit from that first duplex went right back into my business. Within 2 years, I owned 3 properties. Within 5 years, I owned 8. I became obsessed with understanding market trends, with identifying neighborhoods before they became hot, with calculating risk versus reward in ways that became second nature to me. I read every book I could find about real estate investing. I networked with other landlords. I learned from their mistakes and their successes. My mom finally retired at 60, something I never thought would be possible, and I bought her a small house near the beach where she'd always dreamed of living. The day I handed her those keys, watching her cry tears of joy and disbelief, was the day I knew that every sacrifice had been worth it. But here's the thing about success that nobody tells you. It changes how people see you, but only if they know about it, and it also makes you a target if you're not careful. I learned to keep my success private, to blend in, to move through the world without drawing attention to myself, because I'd seen what happened to people who flaunted their wealth. They became magnets for users, for people with ulterior motives, for those who wanted to take rather than build. By the time I was 33, I owned 14 properties across 3 different neighborhoods, all of them completely paid off except for one commercial building that I was strategically using for tax purposes. My portfolio was generating income that most people would consider a dream, but I still drove that same old Honda, still wore simple clothes, still lived in that modest apartment. People who knew me from college would run into me occasionally and ask what I was doing, and I'd just smile and say I was in property management, which was technically true but didn't capture even a fraction of the reality. I liked it that way. I liked being underestimated. I liked watching people make assumptions about my life based on my appearance, because it gave me incredible insight into their character. You can learn everything you need to know about a person by how they treat someone they perceive as being beneath them, and I've seen some truly ugly sides of human nature because of my choice to remain low-key. But nothing, and I mean absolutely nothing, prepared me for what was about to happen with the family that moved into one of my rental properties last year. The property in question was one of my favorites, a beautiful 3-bedroom house in a neighborhood that had transformed dramatically over the past 5 years. I'd bought it when the area was still rough around the edges, and I'd poured my heart into renovating it, making it a place where a family could build memories and feel proud to call home. The previous tenants had been wonderful, a young couple with 2 kids who took care of the place like it was their own, and when they moved out because of a job relocation, I felt genuinely sad to see them go. I listed the property, and within a week I had multiple applications, but one family stood out. On paper, they looked perfect. Stable jobs, excellent credit scores, glowing references from previous landlords. The husband was some kind of mid-level manager at a tech company, and the wife worked in marketing. They had 2 teenage kids, and when I met them for the showing, they seemed polite and professional. The wife, whose name was Jennifer, did most of the talking, going on and on about how perfect the house was for their family, how they'd been searching for months for something in this neighborhood, how excited they were about the local schools. Something about her felt slightly off to me, a certain edge in her voice, a way she looked at me that I couldn't quite put my finger on, but I dismissed it as just nerves or excitement about potentially moving. I approved their application. They signed the lease and they moved in on a sunny Saturday in September. I always make it a point to be present on move-in day, not to hover or micromanage, but to make sure everything goes smoothly and to answer any questions. I introduced myself as the property manager, which again was technically true, and I gave them my phone number for any maintenance issues or concerns. Jennifer barely made eye contact with me during this interaction, and her husband, Mark, seemed friendly enough but clearly let his wife take the lead on everything. Their kids were typical teenagers glued to their phones, barely acknowledging my presence, which I didn't take personally because that's just how teenagers are. I went over all the house rules, explained how the heating system worked, showed them where the circuit breaker was located, all the standard stuff that I'd done dozens of times before. Jennifer interrupted me multiple times during this explanation, making comments about how she already knew all of this, how they'd rented plenty of places before, how they didn't need me to baby them through the process. Her tone was sharp, almost condescending, and I felt that same uneasy feeling I'd had during the showing, but I brushed it off, reminding myself that moving is stressful, and people aren't always at their best during major life transitions. The first month went by without any issues. Rent was paid on time through the automatic payment system I had set up, and I didn't hear from them, which in the landlord world usually means everything is going well. But then I started getting emails and text messages, and the tone of these communications immediately raised red flags for me. Jennifer would send me messages at all hours, sometimes at 11 at night or 6 in the morning, demanding immediate attention for things that were either completely normal or incredibly minor. She once sent me 3 emails in a row because a light bulb burned out, acting like this was some kind of emergency maintenance situation that required my immediate response. When I politely explained that light bulbs were a tenant responsibility according to the lease, she sent back a nasty message about how in all her years of renting, she'd never been expected to change her own light bulbs, which I found almost impossible to believe. Another time, she called me on a Sunday morning because she heard a noise in the attic and was convinced there were animals living up there. I drove over immediately, concerned about a potential pest problem, only to discover that the noise she was hearing was just the normal expansion and contraction of the house materials as the temperature changed, something that happens in literally every house ever built. What bothered me most wasn't the frequency of her complaints, although that was annoying. It was the way she spoke to me. There was this constant undertone of superiority in every interaction, like she was doing me a favor by renting my property, like I should be grateful that someone of her caliber had chosen my house to live in. She'd make comments about how she and her husband were professionals who could afford much nicer places, but they'd chosen this house because of the location and the schools, as if I should feel honored by their presence. She'd talk down to me whenever I came by for any reason, using that voice that people use when they're speaking to someone they consider intellectually inferior or socially beneath them. Have you ever had someone treat you like you're not quite smart enough to understand basic concepts, even though you're perfectly capable? That was how Jennifer made me feel every single time we interacted, and I could feel resentment building inside me, not because I cared what she thought of me personally, but because the disrespect was so blatant and unnecessary. I'm a human being who deserves basic courtesy, regardless of what someone thinks my station in life is, and she seemed incapable of providing even that minimal level of respect. Her husband Mark was different, quieter, less openly hostile, but I noticed he never corrected her behavior or stepped in when she was being particularly rude. He'd just stand there with this uncomfortable smile on his face, occasionally making apologetic gestures with his hands, but never actually apologizing or asking his wife to tone it down. Their kids had picked up on their mother's attitude, and on the few occasions when I encountered them, they'd look right through me like I was invisible, like the help that wasn't worth acknowledging. I started to dread any interaction with this family, and I found myself hoping that each month would pass without any communication from them. But of course, that wasn't how things worked out. The complaints kept coming, each one more ridiculous than the last. She complained about the neighbors being too loud, which I had no control over since they didn't live in my property. She complained about street parking, again something completely outside my jurisdiction. She even complained about the way the afternoon sun came through the living room windows, suggesting that I should install better window treatments at my expense, even though the lease clearly stated that window treatments were the tenant's responsibility if they wanted anything beyond the basic blinds that were already installed. I documented everything, every email, every text message, every phone call, because years of being a landlord had taught me that you need a paper trail for everything. I responded professionally to each complaint, addressing the ones that were legitimate and gently redirecting her on the ones that were tenant responsibilities or simply outside my control. But inside, I was frustrated, hurt even, by the constant disrespect. I started questioning my decision to rent to them, wondering if I should have trusted my initial gut feeling that something was off. The funny thing is, I could have easily told Jennifer who I really was, that I wasn't just some property manager working for a faceless corporation, but the actual owner of not just her house but multiple properties in the area. I could have pulled up my bank statements, shown her my portfolio, made her understand that she was talking down to someone who had built more wealth by 34 than she and her husband might accumulate in their entire lives. But something stopped me. Maybe it was pride, or maybe it was curiosity about just how far her rudeness would go. Or maybe it was some deeper instinct that told me to wait, to observe, to let this situation play out naturally. Then came the day that changed everything, the day that I will never forget as long as I live, the day that tested every ounce of self-control I possessed. It was a Thursday afternoon, around 3 o'clock, and I was at the grocery store picking up supplies for the week. I'd just finished a long morning of dealing with contractors at one of my other properties, and I was tired, hungry, and honestly just looking forward to getting home and relaxing. I was in the produce section, carefully selecting tomatoes because I was planning to make my mom's favorite pasta sauce that evening, when I heard a voice that made my stomach drop. It was Jennifer's voice, loud and carrying across the store in that way that some people talk when they want to be heard, when they want attention, when they want to make sure everyone knows they're having a conversation. I looked up and saw her standing about 20 feet away with 2 other women, clearly friends of hers, and they were looking in my direction, and I instantly knew they were talking about me. I couldn't make out exactly what they were saying at first, but Jennifer's body language told me everything I needed to know. She was gesturing in my direction, rolling her eyes, and her friends were laughing, that mean kind of laughter that takes you right back to middle school and makes you feel small and exposed. My first instinct was to leave, to just abandon my shopping cart and walk out before this situation could get worse, but something made me stay. Maybe it was stubbornness, or maybe it was a need to know exactly what she was saying, or maybe it was that same instinct that had kept me from revealing my true identity to her all these months. I moved slightly closer, pretending to be very interested in the bell peppers, positioning myself where I could hear their conversation without making it obvious that I was listening. What I heard in those next few minutes made my blood run cold and my heart pound so hard I could feel it in my throat. Jennifer was telling her friends about her rental situation, and she was painting a picture of me that was so cruel, so deliberately mean-spirited, so completely unwarranted that I actually felt tears prick at my eyes. She called me pathetic, said I was clearly someone who'd never amounted to anything in life and probably never would. She made fun of my car, saying she couldn't believe that someone in property management would drive such a piece of junk, suggesting that I must be terrible at my job if that's all I could afford. She mocked the way I dressed, saying I looked like I shopped at thrift stores, which actually wasn't far from the truth because I did shop at thrift stores sometimes, but the way she said it was designed to be insulting, to suggest that there was something wrong with me for not prioritizing expensive clothes. Her friends were eating it up, adding their own comments about how you can always tell when someone is low class based on their appearance, how some people just don't have any ambition or drive, how they'd never let themselves end up in such a dead-end position. One of her friends, a blonde woman with a designer handbag that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget, said something about how it must be depressing to spend your life managing other people's properties instead of owning anything yourself. And Jennifer laughed so hard she had to steady herself on the shopping cart. But she wasn't done. Not by a long shot. She started imitating the way I talked, putting on this exaggerated, nervous voice that bore no resemblance to how I actually sounded, making me out to be some kind of simpering, incompetent fool who could barely string a sentence together. She told her friends about the light bulb incident, but she twisted it completely, making it sound like I'd been confused and overwhelmed by her simple request, like I'd made a huge deal out of something trivial, because I didn't understand basic landlord-tenant responsibilities. She complained about having to deal with someone so unprofessional, so clearly out of their depth, someone who obviously came from nothing and would probably return to nothing. Every word was like a knife, each one carefully aimed to wound, to diminish, to reduce me to something less than human. I stood there, my hand frozen on a bell pepper I wasn't even really seeing anymore, and I felt something crack open inside me. It wasn't just anger, although there was plenty of that. It was hurt, deep and sharp, the kind of hurt that comes from being seen as less than for no reason other than someone else's need to feel superior. Have you ever been in a situation where you're being attacked and you have to make a decision in real time about how to respond? Your heart is racing, your thoughts are spinning, and you're running through 1,000 different scenarios in your head, trying to figure out the right move. I could have walked away, pretended I hadn't heard anything, gone home and cried in private like I honestly wanted to do in that moment. I could have confronted her right there in the grocery store, let my emotions pour out in a public scene that would have given everyone something to talk about, but ultimately wouldn't have changed anything. I could have shouted at her, told her exactly what I thought of her cruelty, made sure she knew that her words had hit their target, but I didn't do any of those things. Instead, I took a deep breath, put down the bell pepper I'd been clutching like a lifeline, and I made a decision that surprised even me. I was going to approach them, But I wasn't going to reveal anything yet. I was going to stay calm, stay professional, stay in character as the humble property manager she thought I was, and I was going to observe her reaction when faced with the person she'd just been viciously mocking. I walked over to their group with my heart pounding so hard I thought they might be able to hear it, and I put on the most neutral, professional smile I could manage. Jennifer's face when she saw me approaching was absolutely priceless, a mixture of shock, guilt, and irritation all rolled into one expression. For just a split second, she looked like a child who'd been caught doing something wrong, but then her face hardened into that familiar mask of superiority, like she was angry at me for having the audacity to exist in the same grocery store as her and her friends. I said hello, kept my voice steady despite the storm of emotions raging inside me, and I asked if everything was okay with the house, if there were any issues I needed to address. The audacity of this woman, I swear. She looked me right in the eyes and said everything was fine, absolutely fine. Thank you for asking, using that same condescending tone she always used, like she was speaking to someone who wasn't quite bright enough to pick up on social cues. Her friends were staring at me with barely concealed amusement, clearly in on the joke, clearly enjoying the awkwardness of the situation, and I could see them trying not to laugh. One of them, the blonde with the expensive bag, had this smirk on her face that made me want to scream, but I held it together. I held it together because I realized in that moment that I had something they didn't have, something more powerful than designer handbags or expensive cars or the ability to be cruel without consequences. I had the truth, and I had the choice about when and how to reveal that truth. Jennifer made some excuse about needing to finish her shopping, clearly desperate to get away from me so she and her friends could continue their conversation without the inconvenience of my presence, and she started to move past me with her cart. That's when I made my move, and it wasn't planned, wasn't calculated. It just came out of me like it had been waiting for exactly this moment. I said, in the same calm, professional tone I'd been using all along, that I hoped she was enjoying the house, that it was one of my favorite properties in my portfolio, and that I'd put a lot of work into making it a special place for families. The words hung in the air for a moment, and I watched as confusion flickered across her face, like her brain was trying to process what I'd just said but couldn't quite make sense of it. Her friends had stopped walking and were looking back at us, curious about what had made their little group halt. I continued, my voice still steady, saying that I was really glad the renovations I'd done had worked out so well, that the neighborhood had become even nicer than I'd hoped when I first bought the property years ago, and that I was grateful to have tenants who took care of my investment. You could have heard a pin drop in that grocery store aisle. Jennifer's face went through about 5 different emotions in the span of 3 seconds. Confusion, realization, horror, disbelief, and then finally a pale kind of shock that made her look physically ill. She stuttered, actually stuttered, trying to form words that wouldn't come out properly, and I just stood there waiting, giving her all the time in the world to process what I'd just revealed. Her friends had gone completely silent, the smirks wiped off their faces, replaced by that uncomfortable look people get when they realize they've been party to something really inappropriate. I didn't gloat, didn't raise my voice, didn't do any of the things that a part of me desperately wanted to do. I simply said that I hoped she had a good rest of her day, that I'd see her around the neighborhood since I owned several properties there, and that she should feel free to reach out if she needed anything. Then I turned and walked away, leaving her standing there with her mouth hanging open and her face turning various shades of red and white. My hands were shaking so badly that I had to grip the handle of my shopping cart to steady them, and my vision was blurred with tears that I refused to let fall until I was safely in my car. The walk to the checkout felt like it took hours. My legs felt like jelly and I was running on pure adrenaline. But I made it through, paid for my groceries, and somehow drove myself home without having a complete breakdown. When I finally got inside my apartment, I collapsed on my couch and just let it all out, sobbing in a way I hadn't cried in years. Maybe not since my father died when I was 16. It wasn't just about what had happened at the grocery store, although that was certainly the trigger. It was everything. All the years of working myself to exhaustion, all the times I'd been underestimated and dismissed, all the sacrifices I'd made to build something meaningful, and now this woman who lived in a house I owned, who paid rent that went into my bank account, who benefited from all the improvements I'd carefully made to that property, had stood in a public place and torn me apart for entertainment. The cruelty of it, the unnecessariness of it, the complete lack of empathy or basic human decency, it all crashed over me like a wave, And I let myself feel every bit of it because I knew I needed to process this before I could decide what to do next. Because there would be a next step, there had to be, but I needed to figure out what that looked like, what kind of person I wanted to be, in response to this situation. I called my mom that evening, something I always do when I'm going through something difficult, and I told her everything. She listened without interrupting, the way she's always done, and when I finished, she was quiet for a long moment before she spoke. She told me something I'll never forget, something that helped me see this situation from a different perspective. She said that hurt people, that someone who goes out of their way to be cruel to others is usually dealing with their own pain and insecurities, and that while that doesn't excuse the behavior, it might help explain it. She reminded me that I had a choice in how I responded, that I could respond from a place of anger and revenge, or I could respond from a place of integrity and self-respect. She didn't tell me what to do, she never does, but she helped me understand that whatever I decided, it should be something I could live with long after this situation was over, something that aligned with the values I'd built my life on. We talked for over 2 hours, and by the end of the conversation, I felt calmer, more centered, more clear about what needed to happen next. The next morning, I woke up with a sense of purpose that I hadn't felt the night before. I made myself breakfast, something I rarely take time to do, and I sat at my kitchen table thinking through my options systematically, the way I approach business decisions. I could evict them, which would be legally complicated because they hadn't actually violated any terms of the lease, but I could probably find a way if I really wanted to. I could make their lives miserable in small ways, respond slowly to maintenance requests, be as difficult as they'd been with me, essentially sink to their level. I could expose what had happened on social media, share the story publicly, name names, let the court of public opinion handle it. Or I could handle this with dignity and professionalism, set clear boundaries and demonstrate through my actions what kind of person I was, regardless of how they had chosen to behave. Each option had its appeal, I'm not going to lie, especially the revenge scenarios, but as I sat there weighing everything, I kept coming back to one question. What would make me proud of myself a year from now, 5 years from now, when this situation was long past? I decided to write Jennifer an email, which I drafted and redrafted about 10 times before I sent it. The email was professional but firm, acknowledging what had happened at the grocery store, expressing my disappointment in how she had chosen to speak about me in a public setting, and setting clear expectations for our future interactions. I stated that while I understood moving and adjusting to a new home could be stressful, there was never an excuse for the kind of disrespect I'd witnessed, and that going forward, all communications would need to be conducted with basic courtesy and professionalism. I reminded her that our relationship was a business relationship, one that I took seriously and expected her to take seriously as well. I didn't threaten eviction, didn't make demands beyond common decency, didn't even ask for an apology, though I certainly would have welcomed one. I simply laid out my expectations and made it clear that I would no longer tolerate being spoken to or about in a demeaning manner. Before I hit send, I sat with the email for an hour, reading it over and over, making sure the tone was right, making sure I wasn't reacting from a place of raw emotion, but from a place of thoughtful consideration. The response came faster than I expected. Less than 2 hours after I sent the email, it was from Jennifer, and I could practically feel the panic radiating from the screen. She apologized profusely, called her behavior inexcusable, blamed stress and personal issues she was going through, said she'd never meant for me to hear those things, which was an interesting way of apologizing, since it suggested she thought it was okay to say those things as long as I didn't know about them. She begged me not to evict them, mentioned that her kids loved their schools, that they'd already settled into the neighborhood, that finding another place would be incredibly difficult. There was a lot of explaining and justifying and rationalizing, but buried in all of that was what seemed like genuine remorse, or at least genuine fear of the consequences. Her husband sent a separate email an hour later, much shorter, simply apologizing for his wife's behavior and his own failure to address it, promising that nothing like this would ever happen again, asking for a chance to prove they could be better tenants. I didn't respond right away. I let them sit with their anxiety for a couple of days, not out of cruelty, but because I needed time to really think about what I wanted to do, and also because I felt they needed to understand that actions have consequences, that you can't treat people terribly and expect everything to go back to normal immediately just because you say you're sorry. During those 2 days, I received 3 more emails from Jennifer, each one more desperate than the last, and 2 text messages from Mark. I also got a handwritten letter in the mail, delivered to my office address from Jennifer, which must have taken some effort to track down, where she went into even more detail about how sorry she was, how she'd been raised better than that, how she was ashamed of herself, how she hoped I could find it in my heart to forgive her. The letter felt more genuine than the emails. Maybe because taking the time to write something by hand forces you to really think about what you're saying, or maybe because I could see where her hand had shaken while writing certain parts, where tears had smudged the ink slightly. I finally responded on the 3rd day with a brief email stating that I appreciated their apologies, that I was willing to continue the landlord-tenant relationship provided we could move forward with mutual respect and professionalism, but that this was their one and only chance. I made it clear that any future incidents, any hint of the behavior I'd witnessed, would result in immediate action, and that while I believed in second chances, I didn't believe in third chances. The relief in her response was palpable, thanking me over and over, promising that I wouldn't regret giving them another opportunity, swearing that things would be different. And you know what? Things were different. Dramatically different. Suddenly, every interaction was painfully polite, almost uncomfortably so. Rent that had always been paid on time through autopay was now accompanied by thank you messages. Maintenance requests, which had previously been demands, were now phrased as polite inquiries, always starting with something like, "I'm so sorry to bother you," or, "I know you're busy." When I had to go by the house for a routine inspection a few weeks later, Jennifer greeted me at the door looking nervous and uncomfortable, offering me coffee, thanking me for taking such good care of the property, commenting on improvements she'd noticed in the neighborhood that she was sure were partly due to my investments in the area. It was weird, honestly, this complete 180 in her behavior, and at first, I didn't trust it. I kept waiting for the other shoe to drop, for her to slip back into her old patterns once she felt secure again. But months went by and the change seemed to stick. I ran into her at the grocery store again, ironically, in almost the exact same spot where everything had gone down, and this time she looked mortified, started to apologize again, and I stopped her and said we didn't need to keep rehashing it, that we were moving forward and that was what mattered. She seemed genuinely grateful for that, and we had a brief cordial conversation about how she and her family were settling in, how the kids were doing in school, normal landlord-tenant pleasantries that should have been the baseline all along. Her husband made a point of stopping by my office one day, supposedly to drop off a check for some repair he'd done himself, even though I hadn't asked him to and it wasn't his responsibility. But really I think he wanted to apologize in person, man to man, and express his appreciation for me giving them another chance. But here's what I learned from this whole experience, the lessons that I carry with me now, and that have fundamentally changed how I see the world and my place in it. First, people's treatment of you says everything about them and nothing about you. Jennifer didn't mock me because there was anything actually wrong with me or my life. She mocked me because she needed to feel superior, because tearing someone else down made her feel elevated, because she was operating from a place of her own insecurity and need for validation from her friends. That realization freed me from taking her words personally, even though they hurt deeply in the moment. Second, dignity is more powerful than revenge. I could have destroyed her in that moment in the grocery store, could have humiliated her in front of her friends the way she'd tried to humiliate me, could have made sure everyone in that store knew exactly what kind of person she was, but I didn't, and that restraint gave me a power that being cruel never would have. Third, how you respond to being wronged defines your character far more than how you act when everything is going your way. Anyone can be kind and professional when they're being treated well, but maintaining your integrity when someone has hurt you, that's the real test of who you are. I also learned something about the nature of wealth and success that I hadn't fully understood before. All my life I'd been building, creating, achieving, but I'd kept it quiet, kept it private, thinking that was the humble thing to do, the classy thing to do. And there's wisdom in that for sure. But this experience taught me that sometimes silence can be mistaken for invisibility, and invisibility can make you a target for people who need someone to look down on. I'm not saying I should have walked around flaunting my success or wearing my bank statements on my sleeve, but I realized that there's a difference between humble confidence and hiding. I started to carry myself a little differently after this, not arrogantly, but with a quiet assurance that came from knowing my worth regardless of whether anyone else recognized it. I stopped apologizing for taking up space, stopped making myself smaller to make others comfortable, stopped tolerating disrespect because I was afraid of seeming difficult or problematic. And you know what? The world didn't end. In fact, people started treating me better across the board, not because anything about me had changed fundamentally, but because I was no longer signaling that it was okay to treat me poorly. The relationship with Jennifer and her family stabilized into something professional and cordial, which is really all I ever wanted from the beginning. They continued to rent the house, continued to pay on time and take care of the property, and I continued to be a responsive and fair landlord. We never became friends, which was fine with me because I didn't need that, but we found a way to coexist respectfully, which is sometimes the best outcome you can hope for when a relationship has been damaged. I occasionally wonder if she talks about me to her friends now, if she's told them the full story of what happened, if she's learned anything from the experience beyond just, don't mess with your landlord because they might have more power than you think. I hope she learned something deeper than that, something about kindness and assumptions and the value of treating everyone with basic respect regardless of their perceived status. But I'll never really know, and that's okay. Her growth or lack thereof isn't my responsibility. My responsibility is to my own growth, my own integrity, my own choices about the kind of person I want to be in this world. This experience also changed how I approach my business relationships going forward. I'm more careful about vetting tenants, not just their financial credentials, but trying to get a sense of their character, their values, how they treat people they perceive as service providers. I ask different questions during showings, pay attention to different cues, trust my gut more when something feels off. I'm also more transparent about my role from the beginning, introducing myself as the owner rather than hiding behind the property manager title, because while I still don't flaunt wealth, I've realized that being straightforward about who I am establishes a different dynamic from the start. Most people respond well to knowing they're dealing directly with the owner. It seems to inspire more care and respect for the property and the relationship. The ones who don't respond well, who seem disappointed or annoyed to learn they're dealing with an individual rather than a faceless property management company, those are the ones I've learned to avoid, because that reaction tells me something important about their expectations and their character. My mom was right, as she usually is, about the importance of choosing responses that align with your values rather than reactions that feel good in the moment. I'm proud of how I handled this situation, proud that I didn't let Jennifer's cruelty turn me into someone cruel, proud that I found a way to stand up for myself without losing myself in the process. There are still moments when I think about that day in the grocery store and feel the sting of those words, the humiliation of standing there invisible while someone tore me apart for entertainment. But those moments are getting fewer and further between. I'm healing from it, growing from it, becoming stronger and more sure of myself because of it. And in some weird way, I'm almost grateful it happened, because it taught me things about resilience and dignity and human nature that I might never have learned otherwise. It showed me who I am when I'm tested, when everything in me wants to lash out, and it showed me that I'm capable of taking the high road, even when the low road looks really tempting. If you're watching this and you've ever been in a situation where someone treated you like you were less than, where someone made you feel small and insignificant, where someone used you as a stepping stone to make themselves feel taller, I want you to know that their treatment of you says nothing about your worth. Your value doesn't decrease based on someone's inability to see it. You don't have to prove yourself to people who have already decided to misunderstand you. You don't owe cruelty any response beyond removing yourself from its presence and continuing to build the life you deserve. And if you're in a position where you have the power to respond, to reveal, to show someone that they've severely miscalculated who they're dealing with, I encourage you to think carefully about what kind of response will make you proud of yourself long after the moment has passed. Revenge might feel satisfying in the short term, but integrity feels satisfying forever. Standing your ground doesn't mean destroying someone else. It means refusing to be destroyed yourself, refusing to let someone else's ugliness make you ugly, refusing to compromise your values because someone else has compromised theirs. Have you ever been through something similar? Have you ever had to decide between reacting from anger or responding from integrity? I'd love to hear your stories in the comments below, because I think we all learn from each other's experiences. And sometimes knowing that you're not alone in dealing with difficult people makes the journey a little easier. Understanding this content, understanding that our responses to cruelty define us far more than the cruelty itself defines the people who inflict it, that's incredibly important. It's a lesson that can change how you move through the world, how you handle conflict, how you maintain your sense of self when others are trying to diminish it. If this story touched your heart, if it resonated with something you've been through or made you think about how you want to handle difficult situations in your own life, please leave a like on this video. Your support means everything and helps me continue sharing these real, raw, authentic stories with all of you. And if you want to hear more stories like this, more tales of resilience and dignity and the messy, complicated reality of human relationships, make sure you subscribe to my Truth Revealed Tales and hit that notification bell so you never miss an upload. This community we're building here, it's special, and I'm so grateful to have you as part of it. Thank you for listening. Thank you for being here, and remember, your worth is not determined by how others treat you. It's determined by how you treat yourself and others, especially when it would be easier not to. Take care of yourselves, and I'll see you in the next story.